Hello and welcome to another video from on the channel that you need to not only survive the current apocalypse but actually enjoy. And today we're going to talk about Eye Camels. I said that I was going to talk about that, and somebody wrote me and said, man, I want to hear that Eye Camel story. So anyway, in the Bible, Jesus always, one of the things he liked to do was exaggerate a point so people would actually get it. And one example of that was when he was trying to explain the stupidity of pointing out other people's sins. It seems like that's what religion's all about. It's trying to find a sin that you don't like and then go point your finger at everybody that does that sin. So what Jesus said was, before removing the little teeny tiny speck from your brother's eye, why don't you take that big old log out of your eye? That way you'll be able to see better to get that little speck. So people pretty much got the point, you know, little thing, big thing, and we got to look at ourselves before we look at others. So then later on, he had this rich guy come up to him and say, what do I need to do in order to be in the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus said, well, follow the 10 Commandments, or the law. And he says, well, I already do that. So what else can I do? He said, well, take all your stuff and get rid of it and come follow me. And the guy got all upset and he walked off. And Jesus said, you know, it's going to be easier for a camel to go through an eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of God. And people said, wow, that's terrible. And Jesus said, don't worry, what's impossible for man is possible for God. So there you go, that's the story. And so now we have to try to make this story sound like the last story. You know, you take something that's very small, a small little piece of wood, and talk about a giant piece of wood. So you take a small piece of thread and you want to turn it into a giant piece of thread or something. You want the story to make some kind of sense. You want to, you know, it's like Jesus could have said, it'll be easier for a rowboat to pass through the eye of a needle, or easier for a post hole digger to go through the eye of a needle. Why in the world did he choose camel? Well, I'm going to tell you how I came across this information. Just in my own life, I have started to make fishing nets. And, you know, in my mind, whenever I'm doing something like this, I'm wondering, why in the world am I the only person doing this? I mean, when I was little, my daddy would go out in about an hour and fill a wash tub up with fish, and by that afternoon he had them fish cleaned and our whole freezer was stacked with fish. You know, and now what do we have? Well, we've got people that go out and buy $5 worth of shrimp and put it on a $200 fishing pole to catch $2 worth of fish, and they'll spend all day doing it when they could easily go get one of these and go throw it and get some food. Well, see, that's not sporting. There, people want entertainment. Fishing with a hook is entertainment. This could be compared to work. You know, you go out there and you do physical labor all by yourself, and you go home with fish. So we're in an entertainment-based world, and people aren't interested in doing anything else, especially since they're working 40, 60 hours a week somewhere doing something they hate, and somehow they enjoy sitting there with a pole in their hand. But when I was little, if you're going down the beach, it wasn't an odd thing to see my daddy fishing, because maybe every half a mile there'd be somebody throwing a net. Now, today you could go to Walmart and buy a net for 50 bucks. And I mean, they're monofilament nets. I don't really like them, but they do the job. And even though they're really available, very cheap, nobody owns one. The people that own one never throw one unless they're trying to catch bait so they can go sit out there with a pole to catch fish. Well, there's like an evolution going on here. See, when my daddy got his net, he had to go to the net maker, and there was probably a dozen or 2 dozen of them in the whole county. And he would look at you, see how tall you were, and ask you what you was going to fish for, so he could decide, you know, make a big mesh or a little mesh. You know, do you want it to be a braille net, or do you want it to be a Spanish net? There's just, every net was custom made. You know, what color do you want? And but there were guys like that around. Nowadays, there ain't anybody you find that's making cast nets by hand is in their 80s or 90s, because it's a dying art. I got to thinking, you know, there was a time when everybody that fished had to make a net, because there was no such thing as a net maker. You couldn't go to a net maker and have him make you a net. You had to learn, back in the 1800s, if you wanted to fish, you had to learn how to make a net. And I get to thinking, there must have been a point at one time when people who went fishing, before they could go fishing, had to make their own net. Before they could make their own net, they had to make their own string. See, Jesus was a cast net throwing fisherman. It says that in the Bible. He went with his friends fishing several different times. You know, he didn't just sit in the boat and watch. But if Jesus was fishing with a net, that meant he had to know how to make a net. And he lived a very, very long time ago, so if he knew how to make a net, he had to know how to make string. I'm going to show you something. This right here is this is what you use to make a net, and it's called a needle. I always thought it was called a shuttle. But the guy that's teaching me how to make these nets, he calls it a needle. And so I went online to Google, and I typed in the word net making needle. And sure enough, everybody calls it a net making needle. And I came across a website of a museum where they had a 1,000-year-old net needle, and it looked just like this. On the same page, they had some little rocks, and those rocks had holes bored through them. And they said that they had found those rocks in the Sea of Galilee, and that they were 2,000 years old, and some of the rocks, which were used for fishing weights, had camel hair in them. I didn't know this, but camel's hair is like this long, and they shed it every year, and the people that live in that area will collect that camel hair up off the ground, take it home and clean it off and wrap it onto a spool. And basically, when Jesus said it's easier to put a camel through the eye of a needle, he was saying, it's like in our day, it's easier to put a spool through a needle. Now, that's out of the Bible, outside of the Bible. I mean, I had to do research on the internet, which, you know, makes it seem like, you know, the Bible's trying to confuse us. But remember, when the Bible was written, pretty much everybody knew what Jesus was talking about. In fact, Jesus made a habit of hanging out with poor people that was throwaways. Probably when he was talking to that rich man, the group that he was with was wearing clothes made out of camel hair. And probably Jesus was wearing clothes made out of camel hair too. We're told that John the Baptist wore camel hair clothes, but that's just because he was very poor. But there was a lot more poor people over there than just John the Baptist. But knowing that John the Baptist wore clothes made out of camel hair, then we should just logically conclude that he would have put camel hair in the needle to repair his clothes. That's all. See what a simple story that is and how easy that was to figure out. The churches have had 2,000 years to try to figure out why Jesus didn't say it would be easier to put a rowboat through a needle. Why haven't they? You don't want to survive, don't listen to me.